welcome to Momentum, a Race Forward podcast. I'm Karla Bruce, the Chief of Staff here at Race Forward. Today's episode features a conversation about the historical and long-lasting harms of over-policing in the United States. This is a very timely conversation as national troops have been deployed into U.S. cities. Together with CNN anchor and news correspondent Omar Jimenez, we'll explore the intersections of structural racism, public accountability, and the limitations of reform in a moment where public trust in law enforcement continues to erode, and many see it as a force to control us rather than to keep us safe. Our guest, Omar Jimenez, is an Emmy Award winning correspondent based in New York. Since joining CNN in 2017, he's reported on some of the most defining moments in recent U.S. history, taking us inside emergency rooms, jails, and public demonstrations. He earned his first National News and Documentary Emmy in 2021 for coverage of George Floyd's death, and was nominated in 2022 for Outstanding Emerging Journalist. In the newest podcast from CNN Presents, Tortured Justice, Omar delivers a searing investigation into more than 2 decades of police violence and torture carried out in Chicago under former police commander Jon Burge. From 1970 to 1991, Burge and a group of detectives known as the Midnight Crew used beatings and torture to coerce confessions from over 110 Black men. Through dozens of newly recorded interviews, Tortured Justice unearths how these abuses persisted for so long and how, decades later, the city is still grappling with this legacy of brutality. Omar, thank you so much for being here, and welcome to Momentum, a Race Forward podcast.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So I had the opportunity to listen to Tortured Justice and learn more about the Jon Burge story, which was disturbing and enlightening in so many different ways.
I think that's the right combo of words.
So let's get started. Can you tell our audience about Jon Burge and the Midnight Crew and what you uncovered through your reporting in Tortured Justice? Specifically, what personally drew you to this story?
So, for starters, Jon Burge was this notorious police commander in the city of Chicago, really on the police force from the late 70s into 80s and into the early 90s as well. And his Midnight Crew was sort of the team of detectives that was around him, and they were sort of nicknamed that because of their late shift hours. And what they became notorious for was essentially picking up people and torturing them, a lot of times into false confessions, closing cases at a time where the climate in the city of Chicago was a very violent one, much more violent than it is now. But it created this ripple effect of people being imprisoned that should not have been there. And little by little, these cases, through reporting, through legal efforts, these cases started coming to the forefront. You know, we talk about this in the podcast, but one of the most unlikeliest people ever, someone who killed police officers, actually had a very, very important role in exposing this entire system. So that was sort of Burge and again, his Midnight Crew that really in their prime, so to speak, ran through Chicago in the 80s into early 90s. And then what drew me to this story, when I was a college student, I worked for the Chicago Innocence Project, which, that helps investigate potential wrongful convictions. And one of the people I was working with on staff there was someone who was actually a victim of the Midnight Crew. And I didn't grow up in Chicago, so I didn't really know much about the story at the time. But as he was telling me about what he went through, the torture that he went through, the 30 years in prison that he spent wrongfully, I just couldn't believe what he was saying. And I kept thinking to myself, why don't more people know about this story? And so that was sort of the personal way in to this incredibly large umbrella of history, of policing, of victimhood, of people that are still trying to dig themselves out of what happened almost 4 decades ago in 2025.
So, hearing you talk about the Chicago Innocence Project makes me think about the work of Bryan Stevenson. And I've heard him talk about the reason why things like this can happen, and I would say just racial inequity more broadly. It's really 2 reasons. One is this racial hierarchy, and the other thing is fear. And so, sort of with that idea of racial hierarchy in mind and fear, you mentioned Chicago, and Chicago's been in the news lately, and just can see some parallels between the violence of that era, the Jon Burge era, and sort of the state tactics that are being employed or threatened to be employed in Chicago and local communities across the country, with the federal troops and federal police being sent to these communities. So, do you see a parallel between then and now?
Yeah, I do. I think the parallel, it comes down to power and power dynamics. In Chicago, with the rise of Jon Burge, I mentioned a little bit, but the climate with which he rose within the Chicago Police Department was one of heightened violence in the city. This idea that something needed to be done about the violence because it was getting out of hand. It was coming off of the tail end of a series of large-scale protests. In the late 60s, you had, of course, what happened after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, protests across the country, but in Chicago, the DNC saw pretty famous protests as well before Burge started. But then Fred Hampton was also assassinated. It's part of why we talk about this in the podcast, because it sort of sets up what people felt like was getting out of control. And so it opened the door to this latitude for someone like Jon Burge and his Midnight Crew to do what they needed to do, that the ends would justify the means, and it would incentivize people to look the other way because, hey, they were doing a good job. And none of that was out at the time, but that was the climate with which he was rising and the climate with which they were putting people away wrongfully, as we would later learn. In this situation, the power dynamic comes down to what the administration may believe is a mandate from the voters to take care of immigration, to get those that are in the country illegally out of the country. And some would say, looking at what's going on, that there's a similar type of ends justifying the means mentality here, where some of the fear that I've seen and heard from personally on the streets of Chicago, just from people who look out across their Latino majority neighborhood blocks and don't see the food stands they used to see. Businesses that were immigrant majority businesses seeing a fraction of the business they used to have because of this culture of fear. And yet there are highly produced social media videos going out that are designed to showcase to the country and broader that strength, that handling of that so-called issue that they clearly believe they have wide latitude on. So the parallels come down to, again, those power dynamics and sort of what ends justifying the means are actually excused. And I do think we're seeing some of that now.
Yeah, and you mentioned audience, right? So who is this for? Here at Race Forward, when we think of impact, we talk about it from the perspective of who benefits and who's burdened. And where there are negative impacts, how can we mitigate those impacts? And where there are positive impacts, how can we ensure that those are shared more broadly? And so as I was listening to the episodes, it led me to the question of what was really the desired impact of this type of policing? And really, who was it for? Is it for the local community, or is it for a different audience?
I think that's a great question. At the time in Chicago, when you're trying to drive down violence, in theory, that effort should be for everybody. I mean, you even hear from some of the main people we interviewed in this podcast, they weren't shy about their neighborhood being crazy at the time. They weren't shy that Inglewood was not a great place. The mentality was stay in the house, don't go out. Nobody is disputing that. But they also had a fear of police at the time because they believed that the way that police were handling that issue, particularly in their community, was in an abusive way. And there are documented cases of that. But as we know, there are many non-documented cases of likely what happened at the time. And so the audience for something like that tends to come down to that power dynamic again. Who is in power in the mayor's office at the time? Who is that constituency? Sometimes it comes down to the reputation of a city, that people feel like, well, this dynamic is holding our city back. And when I say our, it could be from those that are higher income neighborhoods and things like that. In this particular situation, present day, the audience doesn't necessarily seem to be Chicago. I mean, just from a political data perspective, Chicago did not vote for this president in an overwhelming way. And so the tactics that we've been seeing, the reason they're being put out on social media is because the audience that supports this administration wants to see that the administration is getting results that they, in theory, voted for. Now, maybe they didn't vote for every single tactic with the way it's being carried out, but that's why you have elections. That will be the ultimate barometer for whether this was actually something that they envisioned when they voted. And so I think it's a similar fashion in the city of Chicago at this particular time. Nobody would disagree that crime is an issue, or in the same sense now, no one would disagree that immigration to this country in an illegal fashion is an issue that needs to be dealt with. But the tactics with which those issues are handled, I think, can go in very, very different directions. And in Chicago, it seemed to be on the agenda of the mayor and those that supported the mayor. And on immigration, it seems to be those on the agenda of the president and those that support the president.
Yeah. Power. It kept coming up for me as well. How it's quote unquote earned, how it's wielded, and sort of how it takes shape in different forms, either within institutions for good or not so good, but also within communities. There was a report that I understand sort of was not widely shared, but as more people came to understand the data in this report, to me seemed like a snowball effect almost. To me, it was the power of data, the power of information, the power of the media. Power was used in so many ways, and it took shape in so many ways in this story.
That's such an interesting point, because this, in many ways, was a battle of institutions. You know, there is a certain power with becoming the mayor, with becoming a state's attorney, with becoming a position that is elected by the people of a city. But there is also power in momentum of media coverage, in momentum of protests, and momentum of legal pursuits. And I think we saw the latter three really come together in a way that challenged the status quo institutions in a way that maybe people weren't ready for at the time. And I say it that way because it took a long time for some of what people were protesting about and suing about and writing about to actually take hold in any significant way. And so I do think that that is just such an interesting way to look at this, because for folks listening, and if you listen to the podcast, you'll know about this, is that when the first article came out, what should have been a bombshell article, sort of talking about the allegations against Jon Burge, firsthand accounts, when it came out, nothing really happened. People read it, it was a thing, and then people moved on. We actually interviewed the writer of that article, who told us he was surprised that nobody picked it up. He thought he was just going to write it, it would make its ripple effects, and then that would be the story. But it didn't happen. After the first lawsuit against Jon Burge that was filed on behalf of a man named Andrew Wilson, that ended up being the most significant thing, or the most significant marker against Jon Burge, since it began sort of this domino effect. But also, eventually Jon Burge was fired, but that wasn't necessarily what the accountability should have looked like in the eyes of people for what happened to Andrew Wilson. It would take decades for the full extent of accountability and cases and exonerations to actually come out. And so even though the tactics of, again, protesters, lawyers, those in the media rivaled the narratives of some of the mainline institutions like the mayor's office, things like that, it would still take decades to undo sort of the wrongs that had been committed decades prior. And I think that really shows that if real change is going to come, it not only takes momentum, you have to have momentum that becomes speed and maintains speed over a sustained period of time. Otherwise, there are just too many avenues to put up a barrier and stop it.
Right. And what was really interesting to me are some of the sort of individual stories, right? You could count the number of instances where these, frankly, crimes were occurring. But it took this sort of step back and look at them to understand that it was a pattern and had really become the practice. And I definitely want to talk about some of those individual stories, the harm to people and their families, and by extension, the community, based on this pattern and practice.
Yeah, I mean, look, the individual stories are the reminders of the stakes in this. You know, we highlighted a man named James Gibson as part of our podcast. We talked about a lot of different people, but James was sort of the focal point and just the way into this particular story, since in 2025, he was still trying to get justice from the city of Chicago when he went to prison in the early 90s for a double murder he did not commit. You know, sitting with him and talking to him, obviously people know that's a long time, 89, 90 to just before 2020 when he got out. But you don't think about the fact that, all right, well, his mom was his rock. He went in, she was alive. Midway through his incarceration, she dies. He spends the other half of his incarceration without his mom, but then gets out and his life is completely different. Nieces that were kids that used to visit him now have their own lives and are married and have their own sets of kids. Technology obviously has completely passed him over. The life that he knew back in the late 80s, coming home from college on top of the world, as he described it to us, that was sort of where his life stopped. And one of the attorneys actually who worked on one of these cases, we didn't include it in the podcast, but she and I were talking, and she again has worked in this wrongful conviction space. Her name is Jennifer Bonjean. She told me about this dynamic, how it takes an afternoon of work to put someone away for decades, and then it takes decades to undo that afternoon of work. And that's really what we're talking about here. And we have people who personify that dynamic in James Gibson, but also in others that you'll hear about in the podcast. And it's just a difficult thing to sit with, because what is justice in a situation like that? And none of the folks we asked on the podcast knew. I'm still struggling with it. You can try, you can give them money, you can help with a job, but what is actually justice here?
Right. And again, justice versus accountability. Those individuals, again, can you ever truly achieve justice for how their lives have been affected and disrupted by this group of people and these institutions that frankly failed to act in so many ways? It's hard, but the other thing that I thought about in listening to the episodes are, what did we learn? What did we gain from these people's experiences? The example of Wilson, who had nothing to really gain by pursuing this injustice against him, was doing it for a bigger purpose, right?
Yeah.
He had killed police. You know, he had done a bad thing, but his treatment gave him this motivation to pursue this. Part of what we are gaining from this is how reform happens.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And there were actually some reforms. Can you talk a bit about those reforms and really what you saw that led to reform, which I think folks in other communities might gain from?
Yeah, I think it's a really important thing to talk about here, because yes, this was very awful. This is someone who was taken in by an institution and spit out on the other side decades later. But if nothing changes, then it's not so much what is the point, because James Gibson would say, well, I went through this. But on a larger scale, what is the point? What has changed? One of the things I talked to a former state's attorney in Chicago about was, when she was a young prosecutor coming up, confessions needed to be videotaped, which was a big change when it came through at the time. There were a few cases that sort of tied into that, but a lot of what happened to those that were put away by Burge and the Midnight Crew wrongfully would not have happened if every confession needed to be videotaped, because we would have seen the method with which those confessions were actually gained. So that's one. There was a moratorium put on the death penalty in the early 2000s because of questions over those on death row who were there wrongfully, tied to Burge and the Midnight Crew as well. And then eventually the death penalty was done away with in the state of Illinois, but that moratorium was a very big step. Well, actually, there's another one too. The Torture Inquiry and Relief Commission was created in Illinois, which essentially was this body to look at cases of potential wrongful conviction. And if there is a there, so to speak, a panel looks at it, and then if they find enough, they can refer it back to a circuit court and get your judicial proceedings worked up again. And the reason why that's important is because a lot of times when folks go to prison, like in Gibson's case, for example, you'll appeal it, but then you'll appeal it to the Supreme Court. There are only a few mechanisms that you have available to you at that time in regards to the crime itself. And it doesn't give you the opportunity of time that others on the outside might be investigating your case. If they uncover new evidence, it just provides a little bit of an easier avenue in to get your case sort of jump-started. So that's another change that was in Illinois. But more broadly, I mean, police reform has come a long way, even if people don't think progress has come fast enough. In Chicago as well, they created the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, COPA as it's known, which is a separate civilian-led review body that looks at police-involved shootings and incidents. And they use that as opposed to the police investigating themselves on a whole-scale basis. In places across the country, the institution of body cameras was a very, very major thing. Even though they don't catch everything, it was another set of eyes that could help people get to the truth in a shooting, in an interaction, in what led up to a shooting, which oftentimes provides context for how these unfold. It also critically can exonerate an officer as well. If they feel like they did the right thing, it's in their best interest to have the body cameras rolling. And then we saw pickup from the federal government for a time, getting into consent decrees and pattern and practice investigations into police departments in Chicago in the wake of the Laquan McDonald shooting, but also in Baltimore after the death of Freddie Gray. There were attempts to do so in Louisville, Breonna Taylor's killing, and in Minneapolis after George Floyd's killing. But those efforts were sort of scaled back when the new Trump administration came in. But at the very least, there have been efforts going on, largely led at the state level and the city and local level, to sort of get to what they believe is the best practice. Now, is it perfect? You just have to watch the news for a week, and I can tell you it is not perfect. You can see that. But is it better than it was in terms of accountability? I have to believe yes, just because of the various avenues there are for accountability that did not exist decades ago, and that is still sort of crawling forward now.
You shared the story of Mr. Gibson, but there were a long list of people like Mr. Gibson. And exoneration is important, but justice and accountability are two distinctly different outcomes. And so there's accountability from the perspective of holding those accountable who caused harm. But what about accountability to these people whose lives were disrupted?
Yeah, and I think that's such a great question because people are still trying to figure it out. With James Gibson, he obviously was exonerated. He got out, so he has his freedom back. He was able to pursue a civil settlement from the city, so he got some money, but the price he paid was 30 years of his life, just about losing his mom, losing the relationship he had with his family, losing the relationship he had with his community. And so essentially he is starting back from the beginning. And I think what people don't see is they see these exonerees in front of the camera celebrating with their settlements or getting out. But then eventually you got to go find a job. They went in their 20s. They're now in their 60s, 70s. the world is just completely different. And that doesn't even get into the social dynamics where they could get into trouble again. And now they're back sort of in that system that caught them up years ago, hopefully for something much less serious. But again, it is still getting caught up no less. And I know I've heard, I should say, one of the exonerees, I won't name him because we haven't got a chance to have a real conversation about this, but when he was exonerated, it was great. I remember years later having a conversation with him for something separate, but I was told by friends and family of his that he wasn't doing so well, that he did get into a little bit more legal trouble, some minor stuff, but stuff around drinking. And, you know, I think it just shows that the support, the accountability, the what is actually owed needs to have a further runway outside of just the exoneration moment and the civil settlement moment, because it just creates a recipe, not for everyone, but it creates a recipe for decline, for detrimental behavior. And I think there are a lot of real life examples that bring that to bear.
Yeah, one of the takeaways for me was the family.
Yeah.
James Gibson's family in particular, and the difference that having family made.
Yeah.
And sort of coming back into community with some level of support from family, but that's not always the case. And so really intentional efforts at repair and restoration are critical. Again, exoneration is important, but it's really placing people in a position of opportunity, right?
Yeah.
Opportunities that are created for these folks to rebuild and hopefully move in a direction, again, that can't replace what's happened in the past, but hopefully positions them for a better future.
Yeah. You know, James Gibson has a friend who grew up in the same neighborhood, was arrested in connection with the same crime, and was also beaten and sent to prison and sentenced to decades for being tied to that. They didn't know it, but the police basically played them off of each other. And so then they both went to prison for something they swore they didn't do. Eventually, Keith Smith is his name, or as he's called, he is eventually let out of prison, but in part for taking what's known as an Alford plea, which essentially is in part an admission of guilt, and that allows him to go free. Now, when you do that, you don't have the ability to pursue civil litigation, so you can't go after money, but you're out. James Gibson did go the route where you were able to pursue a civil claim, but it took years longer of him in prison to actually do that. And so here you have two men, just to highlight the range of options from this system right now. You have two men, one who chose freedom but wasn't able to get money, one who didn't necessarily choose money but was willing to sacrifice a little bit more freedom for a more holistic declaration of innocence, which is what he got. And you look at their lives now. Gibson, who we talk about here, he was able to get a settlement, and time will tell with how he handles it and how he moves forward. But the last time I spoke to him, he seemed to be doing well. But then the other guy, Keith Smith, I met him recently and spoke to him. He told me he's basically homeless. He's going from odd job to odd job, and that seems to be the payback of freedom that he was able to get. And again, it is not the same. He didn't get this big certificate of innocence. He wasn't declared innocent by the state, but it was this mentality of do what you need to do to get out. And he did that. And even still, freedom wasn't enough to bring him back into the world in the way that I'm sure he would have liked. And so it's difficult. And so that runway of accountability for those who have those options available to them, it's almost just as important as the effort it takes to actually exonerate someone. If accountability is exoneration, then accountability should also include the life that you're exonerating them into. You know what I mean? It's apparent in the folks I've talked to for this story, for this podcast. It doesn't seem like there are any options for that right now, at least from a state or city perspective. I know there are likely a lot of private organizations and nonprofits that help on that front, but it is a very difficult dynamic that's very prevalent.
Yeah. And really, what Burge ended up being penalized for wasn't the torture.
Yeah.
Because the statute of limitations had expired. And so he lost his job, but he was able to retain his pension.
Yeah.
It goes back to the word we keep talking about is power. And what powers are in place that really stifle accountability? Just thinking about the freedom of the last gentleman that you spoke about, close to homeless, yet the person that was really truly responsible for these crimes was able to retire. There's a dichotomy there that I think is worth exploring in terms of the value of human life.
Yeah.
When I've interacted in my professional life with police, there's a couple of phrases I've heard used repeatedly. One is the sanctity of life. And the other is nobody hates a crooked cop more than cops.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, I think there are some dynamics at play here that really are about people being taken care of.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think in a sense, especially with policing, because there are so many police officers that do such a great work, a system is a system. And so the benefits that go to the best of the police officers that have the best of intentions that get caught up maybe in an unfortunate situation, the same benefits that are extended to them also have to get extended to those that are so-called the worst of the worst, that maybe never had good intentions, that maybe did something over a sustained period of time that people know about, but they can't necessarily prove. Those same benefits from that system are going to apply. It's part of why we took time towards the end of this podcast to sort of ask this question of what is justice? Because, you can look at a few different things. All right, Jon Burge was fired. Maybe that was justice. All right, yep, we got accountability. He's off the force. We're done. All right, he's federally prosecuted, found guilty. All right, maybe that's it. All right, finally, we did it. We prosecuted Jon Burge. We found him guilty. We sent him to prison. Bravo, job well done. But it wasn't for the torture that was found through various reports and people and everything. That's not what he went to prison for. He went to prison because prosecutors were able to get creative and find something that he messed up on, and they chose to hold him accountable on that front. But was that justice? You could ask anybody tied directly to this case. I don't think they would agree that it's justice. The detectives that were on the Midnight Crew, there was less attention paid to them, but their names pop up in court documents and civil lawsuits and allegations going back decades. But they didn't, quote unquote, mess up in the same way that Jon Burge did in the sense of the perjury case. And so they were never held accountable in any sense. They're living their lives completely freely, as some of those they helped put away are still trying to get out of prison or are out of prison trying to figure out their new lives ahead. I mean, for James Gibson, you get out of prison, you finally prove that you were right and that you didn't do this, but is that justice? Is the $15 million justice? What about the person at the center of the crime that allegedly was done by Gibson back in 1989, this double murder? We spoke to the son of one of the men that was murdered that night, who thought he got justice back in 1990 when they arrested the so-called murderer for killing his father, only to find out 30 years later that actually that wasn't justice because they got the wrong guy. And I asked him about that, and I asked him if he was angry at Burge. And he said yes, because they screwed up justice for him. They screwed up accountability for him. And so while one set of ideals or objectives was being prioritized here, another set was being lost over here. I think when you look at accountability here and justice here, it's why I really liked the name tortured justice, because obviously we are talking about torture in pursuit of so-called justice, in pursuit of closing cases. That's at the heart of this story. But when you do get to that resolution on the other side, it's this tortured form of existence. It's, for lack of a better term, it's this tortured justice that you now have to live with moving forward, that is not as clean as you would hope it would be on paper. And that's the reality for not just the folks we highlighted in this podcast. This was just a small slice of the reality of this story. It's the reality for a lot of the people that were directly touched by this and are still trying to figure out ways to move forward.
How do we discourage these things from happening? Again, there was a story woven here about how power is held by people in lots of different forms that amplified this story and eventually led to the reforms associated with what happened. So, how do we discourage things like this from happening again?
Well, there's two things. One, I think the blueprint was in this podcast. We saw a real life case study of something that people knew was going on, but what are you going to do about it? Well, you have someone write about it. You have the documentation. All right, now we're documenting as much as possible what's happening. Then you have the litigation side of things. All right, are there opportunities to sue? Are there opportunities to probe on a legal basis? Are there opportunities to depose, which we found would eventually become the basis for a lot of these allegations coming out? And then, as we talk about, and you can hear in the podcast through some archival footage that we got, the protests that sort of grew in numbers, some would say helped contribute to the dynamic around Burge being fired. And so it's multifaceted, but it has to be consistent. Because if you mark when the first article came out, the first documentation, so to speak, to when, if we use this example, Burge was actually sentenced to prison, we're talking about a period of almost 20 years. And in that 20 years, you were talking about sustained articles, sustained litigation, sustained attention, to the point that the institutions that in theory would be designed to protect some of these people, in this case Burge, had no choice but to at least take these calls seriously. That is a case study to sort of how to get an institution or a system's attention. And if you're successful, that's what leads to reform, but it takes a long time. The other thing that we weren't able to include in the podcast, but I thought is really interesting, was we spoke to former Cook County State's Attorney Kim Fox, who was known as sort of a reformer when she came into that office. And one of the things she talked about was a lot of people have to do the right thing for the right thing to happen. It's like turning a cruise ship. It's not going to happen immediately, but if you hold left long enough, eventually the ship is going to turn. But it's how many people are holding that left, and how long are you holding that left for that right direction, that right course to be charted. And that's another lesson, I think, from this podcast, that just because you get one person in office, or just because you get one person you believe in a position of power, that does not automatically mean the reform you're looking for or the change you might be looking for is going to happen. It takes a system, and it takes sustained momentum toward a desired goal for that to happen. And that is evident in this story as well. So there are parallels, obviously, to everyday life. What's past is present is future. But I do think the uniting force sort of in what we saw was this idea of sustaining momentum. As John Conroy, the author, told us in the podcast, even when he put out the first article that should have been a bombshell and nobody paid attention to it, it turned out that we're still talking about it decades later, because that ended up being the very beginning of this spark that became a fire and that became actual change.
And that's the purpose of this podcast, sustaining momentum. So thank you for that. And thank you to the families and the individuals that shared their stories to make the podcast possible. And thank you for sharing it with us.
And on that note, too, just quickly, I will say the people we spoke to were incredibly candid and really opened up. And, you never have to speak to someone like me for a story like this, but I'm glad that they did. And I hope people get a lot out of their authenticity and them being so candid. And thank you for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much, Omar. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Momentum, a Race Forward podcast. We want to thank Omar Jimenez and the entire team at CNN Podcast for making this important conversation possible. To hear Omar's reporting on Jon Burge and the Midnight Crew, listen to all 3 episodes of CNN Presents Tortured Justice on CNN.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and everywhere you get your podcasts. Listen and subscribe to Momentum, a Race Forward podcast, and follow Race Forward on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. Until next time, let's keep the momentum going.